we have made some changes this year, but where we haven't made any changes because we really, it works well. We've had our presenters. We've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I think 7 presenters thus far today. I was telling someone, well, how did it go? And I said, this happens every year. We start off, it's 9 in the morning, and I said, oh my God, how are we ever going to get through this day? Next thing I turn around is 5. I said, wow, this is incredible. What makes the symposium are the presenters. This year we've had several who have been here before and others who have not. Those who've been here before realize some of the tweaks we made, and it's worked out really well. I want to make one, I'm not sure what we call it, housekeeping, but let's assume it is. There are more people presenting with spouses than there are places on the shuttle, which was true this morning, and I think it's the same number. Marty Shukert, who you listened to with great enjoyment earlier, and Aviva live not that far from the hotel. Most Jewish families in Omaha live in West Omaha, and they all very graciously agreed to take 2 people. So when the program's over,
I'm not staying.
Is that right?
Hotel.
Did I misstate it?
No, that's good.
No. Okay.
No, we're just making it clear that they have a hotel room. They're not
They're not staying at our house.
Yes. It's a distinct and distinctive pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker this evening, Ori Soltes. It's a line you often hear. He's no stranger to us, and in fact, that is the case. Do you know how many symposia? I was going to look it up. Perhaps 5. Who's counting? This is Ori's first time as a keynote presenter. He's also spoken for the Synagogue, Bethel. I think he's spoken as well through the Federation. He's one of our favorites. And while I could say a lot about him, I will say 2 things about Ori. We calculate that we met 35 years ago. I was 45 and he was younger. He's still younger. I don't understand it. He didn't get any older. And it was a very odd conference on archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania. But we still remember, he remembers the sessions, and I remember some of the other activities. But it was a great time, and I'm honored and pleased to have known Ori all these years and to be able to introduce him tonight. He has been at Georgetown for almost 3 decades, and I'm not going to say another word because Ori can say it. Oh, yes, thank you. Ori can say it, but we're first going to hear from Steve. Thank you.
I'm Steve Rigas, and I'm here tonight to represent the Jewish Federation of Omaha and the constituent parts of our program, the 33rd Annual Symposium, which is the Klutznick Chair in Jewish Civilization at Creighton, and the Schwab Center for Jewish and Israeli Studies at UNO, and the Harris Center at UNL, and the Kripke Center at Creighton University. We want to welcome all the visiting scholars, and we welcome everybody else who has come to participate in this program during today or tonight and tomorrow. It's really a wonderful thing. We were just visiting for a minute or 2 about the need to come together to do good. And that's what this symposium had highlighted, that about coming together. In Omaha, Nebraska, 33 years of accomplishment. That is something to really be proud of. Up till now, we didn't have any bad weather. I can't change that. That's the way it was. But we appreciate your coming out and so forth. Basically, the coming together, I want to emphasize again, it started with my sister and my uncle, Philip Klesnick, and my aunt, Ethel. He was a Jewish kid from Kansas City who came to Omaha. One of the primary reasons is to go to Creighton Law School. Why Creighton Law School in Omaha, Nebraska? It's because there was a time where Jews were restricted where they wanted to go for a college education. Even sometimes a public university may not have it in writing, but it had a code. But despite all that, here was a Jesuit Catholic university, and they said to the Jewish community, we welcome you, not to convert you, but to just give you an education which you desire. And that meant so much to him. And it meant so much to so many other Jewish professionals in that era. Dentists, physicians, other professionals, get an education and how much that meant. So Phil Klesnick never forgot what this Catholic Jesuit university did for him, and he tried to repay that in a certain way in his lifetime. Creighton University Law Library, and particularly the setting up a chair with a chair in Jewish civilization at a Catholic university. So the product of the Jewish Federation of Omaha, the Klesnick family, and Creighton University. Remarkable. And today too, coming together, now we include our partners at UNO, at UNL, and so forth, to produce this thing. It's something to really be treasured today and applauded. And so once again, I want to welcome all of you here to participate in this wonderful program. Thank you.
Yes, I feel like the end of Philip Roth's Portnoy's complaint. And now you shall begin. So my topic, as you are aware, is Tale of Two Cities, about Venice and Prague. As you know, at the very least from Alan's talk today, there are a lot of cities one could talk about. We could talk about Cluj, we could talk about New York, we could talk about Amsterdam. I chose Venice and Prague because I thought they were particularly interesting and they dovetail in certain ways, chronologically, kind of, well, you'll see. And because of certain aspects of the two cities that connect them, as well as differentiate them.
I'm too far ahead.
Yeah, you are. See, I don't want anything up here.
No worries.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. Confinement can lead, by paradox, through an effective address of the need to find comfort to creativity and productivity. Venice, as you probably are aware, was established during what we popularly refer to as the barbarian era. And those who lived in that coastal zone, in order to become safe from barbarian incursions, went out to islands in and beyond this lagoon in the northeast corner of what is, of course, today Italy. Something like 100 islands, 150 waterways between them, over 200 bridges. Anyway, that's what the guide said when I was 14, and I never counted them, so I assume it's true, because guides never do other than tell you the truth. And the traditional date of this is 797, rather. So Venice, surrounded as it was by water, not surprisingly, became a very important place for trading, mercantile kind of community, where it seems above all that their interest was in figuring out how to become wealthy by way of the high seas and by way of trading and the like. And so much so that they were at times opposed even to their fellow Italian city-states, and were more inclined, when it served their purposes, to be allied actually with the Ottoman Turks, who would otherwise have been the enemies of all the Italian city-states. And now I would love to put up the first image and share a screen. So many of you will recognize this image. It's ascribed to Gentile Bellini, who in the 1480s was regarded as the preeminent Venetian painter. Later on, and in our own day, we think of his brother Giovanni as more talented than he. But he was sent by the Venetians at the request of the Sultan Mehmed II, Mehmed Fatih, Mehmed the Conqueror, in order to bring Western art into the Ottoman Turkish reality. And of course, the Venetians had for generations done portraits of their doges. So Mehmed really liked that idea. And so you see a portrait of Mehmed II that, as I said, is at least ascribed to Gentile. He brought back with him ideas from the Ottomans, such as how to marble paper. So all that papal marbling that we associate with Italy in general, Venice in particular, it was an Ottoman Turkish invention, just to give you kind of one example. So here's the thing. Venice was far-reaching in its connections because of the nature of its economy. So one might suppose, and up to a point, one would be correct, that they would have been more open to having Jews settle among them as traders and merchants than perhaps other kinds of places in or beyond Italy would have been, except you'd only be half right, because you'd be half wrong. Because on the other hand, they might view Jews as mercantile trading types, as competitors for them. So in fact, the Jewish position within Venice over the centuries kind of goes up and down. In the 10th century, for example, there's a law that forbids ships bearing Jews or Jewish goods to come into the lagoon among the islands. On the other hand, by the 11th century, they realized, there are certain things that we need, and the German Jews, because they're from over there, and whether they're really Germans or just over the other side of the Alps, they're all, for the Venetians, called Tedeschi, or we would say Ashkenazi perhaps, but they're not necessarily Rhineland Jews or whoever knows where from. That some of them were allowed to settle because they could play the role of moneylenders, which, as you know, was a role that Jews could play throughout Christendom, since good Christians don't loan and extract interest from those to whom they lend. So how can we lend? A good Christian king can't tax his own citizens because that's thought of as the same thing. But if the Jews do the tax farming for us, or if the Jews become moneylenders among us, of course, Tractate Sanhedrin looks down upon that for Jews, but Jews doing it to Christians, Christians doing it to Jews, this kind of interdenominational taxing and interest extracting is not only acceptable, that's just simply, of course, how it was over the many centuries. So we first find some German, if that's what they are, Jews settling in Venice in the 11th century. In the 11th and 12th, generally speaking, there's a lot of economic growth. And so we see a document, for example, already in 1090, the Doge Vitale Falero, it's a deed of gift, but it mentions the Giudecca. So there's already an official area that is the Jewish inhabitation in and among those islands by that point. And then we can see certain benchmark moments. In 1152, there's a census that claims there are 1,300 Jews in Venice. No doubt an exaggeration. But the point is there's a critical mass. And gradually over the 13th and 14th century, as the Venetian economy grows, more Jews come from over the Alps, but also now from the south and central parts of Italy. I remind you, these are all different city-states. The south is Naples. In the middle, you've got the Papal States. Then you've got Florence, and over there, you've got Milan, and so on. None of this is going to become Italy, per se, until we get to the middle of the 19th century. So anyway, By 1366, we're aware of 3 different pawnbroking shops run by Jews in Venice. In 1386, there's a land grant to the Jews for a cemetery. And as you all know, the first thing that Jews want if they want land in some place, it's for a cemetery, not for a synagogue. You can pray anywhere, but you want territory in which to bury your dead. That goes all the way back to Genesis 23, if I'm not mistaken. That Hebrew, what was his name? Abraham, I think, didn't bargain, simply said okay, and purchased from Ephron the Hittite the cave of Machpelah and the field upon it as a burial site for Sarah. So that kind of sets a tone with respect to the first consideration, if you're interested in real estate, that has been a leitmotif, of course, across Jewish history. By 1396, on the other hand, the Jews are banished because some irregularities in the banking processes suggest some malfeasances among them. It's not clear whether that banishment was complete, was even undertaken seriously at all, but we do know that shortly thereafter, the Senate of Venice decreed that Jews had to wear distinctive marks on their clothing. Usually it was something like a yellow circle or a red felt hat, not necessarily pointed, but something of that ilk. But in any case, by about 1450, there were Jews settling or resettling or more numbers coming to Venice, and there were stipulations limiting things that they could do, things that they could be, and so on and so forth. Certainly the numbers were amplified in the 1480s, after Provence ceased to be papal territory and Jews were not as safe there as they had been before. And obviously after 1492, there would have been eventually an influx of Jews either directly coming at that point from Spain or gradually arriving by way of other locations to which Jews fleeing Spain in the time of the expulsion of 1492 had gone. So all of that brings us to March 29th, 1516, which is when the Doge Leonardo Loredan, and no relationship to Leonardo Greenspoon, in case you wondered, as I'm sure you may have. And let's see, where are we? Yeah. We love these mics, don't we? They were confined to an area, you can see it sort of in dead center of this image, which was referred to as the ghetto, or more precisely, the Ghetto Nuovo, the new ghetto. It was the site of a former foundry that had ceased to function by the 14th century, and in fact, there is some discussion as to where the word ghetto comes from. The most common assumption, with which I concur, is that it is the Venetian dialect for what an Italian getto would mean, a foundry, coming from a verb which can mean to throw, but it also can mean to smelt, to pour burning liquid. There have been theories that it came from borghetto, which would mean little town, or that it even came from the Hebrew word get, right, for divorce, because the community is being divorced from the larger Venetian community. I love that one, but I don't think it's accurate. And the area in which they live, remember these are all islands anyway, is a natural kind of island connected to other places by 2 bridges. They place 2 gates, and it's the Jewish community that is responsible for the paycheck that keeps the guards by the gates all night long. And the Jews are required to be within those gates, within the ghetto area, from sunset to sunrise. They're free to move about and do whatever they do during the daytime, but they've got to be back there by nightfall. And there are penalties if you're caught outside the ghetto after night has fallen. And the old ghetto looks something like this from above. So you can see just to the left of your screen, one of those 2 bridges, one of those 2 entries, obviously at this point missing its gate. Here's another shot from ground level. So it's a relatively circumscribed area, obviously. We're talking about not the opportunity to spread your wings in a Levantine suburb, Martin, but something which is much more confined than that. And in fact, by 1541, the area next door became a second area into which Jews were confined, paradoxically for us called the Old Ghetto. So the new ghetto precedes the old ghetto because the reference is to the old foundry, new foundry. It has nothing to do with the old circumscription and the new circumscription. And just if you want to take it a little bit further, by 1633, there's yet a third area to the other side of the new ghetto called the newest ghetto. So there are ultimately, by that time, three. The Jewish population, it seems, by 1555, there's a census, and there are about 160,000 people in Venice, and less than 1,000, about 923 Jews. And one of the things about Venice that you're probably aware is that all of its building interiors start, so to speak, minimally on the second floor. Nothing starts on the first floor because you have what's called acqua alta. You have high water, you have flooding that is all the time. This is a San Marco Square, and you can see the Venetians to this day, they lay out large sidewalks made of wood that so people can get over the water, and sometimes it's not enough. Well, this is of course perfect. To have your building interior start on the second floor or higher is perfect for a synagogue because the Talmudic dictum, as you all know, says you've got to, this Beit HaKnesset, it's got to be elevated above the community. And if you think, as Steve Fine is immediately at this moment thinking, of ancient synagogues like Chorazim, like Kfar Nahum, like Katzrin, where they're on these little platforms, of course, that's perfectly fine. But once you get into most of medieval Christian Europe, the synagogues kind of huddle inside the community. They're not allowed to stand out. So how can I fulfill that? Well, interior I can elevate. And you have that very obviously in places like Carpentras, like Cavaillon, like Padua. And of course, in Venice, it's not just that you have it, it's a natural. So it's a combination of the circumstances which want you to elevate your sanctuary to the second floor or higher anyway, with the way in which that helps you fulfill that kind of Talmudic dictum. Now, each of the synagogues that develops will ultimately be called not a synagoga, but a scola. And that reflects really, the marriage of two different features. One is that the Venetians themselves refer to particularly the larger churches that are attached to charitable and educational institutions and the like as scole. That's the plural, scola, scole. So for the Venetian synagogues that are similarly, not surprising, Beit Knesset attached to Beit Midrash, are also called scole, but it's also simply the Italianized version of what if we go north of the Alps, we find when the place is called a shul, as some of you Yiddish speakers, I believe, still use that word to refer to your synagogues. And as you know, that doesn't strictly mean a house of prayer. It's got a much broader kind of context. So chronologically speaking, and apropos of coming from north of the Alps, because this is the first group of Jews that actually settled in Venice, the Scuola Grande Tedesca, so the great German synagogue, was built initially in 1528. So that's the first synagogue that is extant that we know of that is built there, or I should say, placed within buildings that are already there, and the space is really circumscribed where it can be built. By the way, it's on the 4th and 5th floors of the building, so it's not a building dedicated to simply synagogue-ness. It's the upper stories, the 4th being where the men are, up above the balcony there being where the women are, so the 4th and 5th floors. And initially, the synagogue would have been configured, and it's oddly shaped. You can see it's kind of trapezoidal, with the bima that you're looking at here in the middle, which is the norm, of course, in the Ashkenazi world. And by the way, that's water just beyond those windows. So your natural light is coming in that way. But the way you see it here reflects a change that came about in the 17th century, where perhaps imitating what would have been by then the case for all the extant 5 synagogues in Venice, they followed what used to be referred to as the Sephardi bipole system because it was assumed to have begun in Spain. We may be less certain about that now, but the point is it's still a bipole system where you've got the bima and the aron, or the teva and the hechal, which would be the Sephardi terminology, at the far ends of your space. And the seating is, of course, between them. So you're always sort of turning 45 degrees this way or 45 degrees that way. You never have your back either to where the scrolls are kept or the place from which the scrolls are being read. And that's the kind of configuration we have here. And just to look at some of the details, I mean, it's spectacular, it's magnificent. This is clearly not a community that was not capable of organizing funds to create a glorious synagogue interior for prayer. And you can see that it looks almost, well, very theatrical. And you have the men below and the women to repeat up above around, looking over, as it were. And we are looking once again still toward the bima. And at the opposite end, here is the aron. And you can see at least three things about it. One, and to remind you, this is now 17th century. So it is as Baroque as you could hope to have, both in the sense that it is so infinitely decorated, and by the way, with gold leaf. And second, if you look, for example, at that triangular fronton above it, it's broken, right? Which is a broken pediment, is part of the Baroque. And aside from that, you have this wild and woolly window from which more light is coming in from this side. So the light is coming in from here toward the bima and from those windows towards the aron. And part of the complications of spacing is we want it east-west so that we can pray towards the east. We don't want it north-south. So that's why we've got to take the space that is available to us regardless of its configuration. And you can imagine that at sundown, the light coming from those three windows behind the bima would be just causing an absolute glistening light on the aron that we're looking at, with its steps leading up, a series of four of them, three of them festooned with Hebrew writing into the bargain. So a whole series of elements. And I should add one more detail that I did not call to your attention, but it's important. And that is, if you look just below the level of the women's section, you recognize what look at first glance like marble panels. They're not. They're designed to look like that. It's faux marble. It's actually made from a combination of lime with marble dust called marmarino, which was very popular in Venice. It actually wears better and it's more durable than having marble panels, which are more likely to crack over time. And that's one of the features that was used in this particular scuola. Second scuola in terms of pure chronology is what's called the canton, the scuola canton, 1531, 1532, possibly, not certainly, used for the Provençal community that came in large numbers after the 1480s, as I mentioned, and gradually felt that they wanted their own space. That's not certain that it was theirs. Neither is it certain regarding where the word canton comes from, because there was an Ashkenazi family named Canton. So it might have been built by them as a kind of family shul. Or more likely, I think, canton is the Venetian word for corner. And of course, that's where it's placed, in the corner. And by the way, again, if you're looking for the synagogue, work your way up to the wood slats on the third floor. That's where it actually is. And then you can see that nice little skylight above that as well. Here you're looking in at it. So as modest as it appeared on the exterior, and it's small, maybe room for 25 people to pray, we're again looking towards the aron, or the Heichal, if we're thinking of this as a Sephardic institution. And at the opposite end, the bima, or the teva. And I call your attention just to two particular features here. One is the pair of columns left and right. You've seen those in all kinds of synagogues and synagogue decors all over the place. A reference to Yachin and Boaz, the two columns from Solomon's temple that are singled out there in the book of Kings, chapter 6. And also the number of steps going up to where one speaks, which is 5, intended to connote the 5 books of the Torah, because the Venetians love this kind of symbolism. And I'll call your attention to a third thing. Look up towards the top of that figure, close your eyes, open them again. And you have this wonderful skylight, which we saw from the outside, rather modest. but here we see it beautifully configured with a light blue and stars so as to sort of suggest heaven. And then you've got the light of heaven from above looking down on us. The third synagogue that is of interest is called the Levantine, Levantina Synagogue. This was built and designed to serve Jews coming from the Middle East, although it's likely that many or most or even all of those actually were Sephardim from Spain or Portugal who had worked their way across the Mediterranean into Ottoman Turkish territories and then ended up in their trading with the Venetians, ultimately coming to Venice. In any case, it was three things about it. One, the year of its construction was about 1538, so it's not that much later. 10 years after the Ashkenazi synagogue, just 6 or 7 years after the Canton. So that's one detail of it. The second detail is this extraordinary aron, or if you will, heichal, which as you can see, it's a complicated picture, but you can see it from the front now, has a pair of stairs going up from the left and up from the right, as opposed to a stair going straight up the center. The innovator in that kind of an idea, not having a staircase that goes straight up and having it come from the sides, was none other than Michelangelo Buonarroti, who in the same year when that synagogue was built, was redesigned the whole Campidoglio in Rome, including, in this case, the Palazzo dei Senatori, and he added this innovative idea of stairs coming from the two sides, offering a diagonal that dynamizes what is otherwise a straight vertical horizontal configuration. Now, the thing about what we were just looking at, however, and that's the third issue, is that the interior that we were actually seeing was completely redesigned in 1689 by Andrea Brustoloni, who was a very important architect and internal designer, and apparently designed some theaters as well. So it's very likely, it's very logical, both that he would have been aware of Michelangelo, whereas it would be less likely when this was built in 1538, perhaps, that the Jewish community would have been per se aware of what Michelangelo was doing that very year in Rome. But by the time we get to Brustoloni, this was renowned what Michelangelo had done. And of course, he adopted and adapted it. He made it curvilinear instead of straightforward. And if I can put it this way, that much more theatrical. And again, think about the relative wealth of the community that would have been able to engage someone of that ilk to do its renovation. And in the first place, when the Levantine was built, this was the community, for whatever reasons, that apparently the Venetians felt most comfortable allowing to be outside the ghetto, or at least semi-outside the ghetto. So this is one synagogue not built in the so-called New Ghetto, which is the first, the older one of 1516. This was built just outside in 1538, and remember that 3 years later, 1541, that becomes ghettoized. So the Old Ghetto, which is the newer place, is confined. But at the time that this was built, it was just outside the ghetto premises. And this was the first synagogue that was built from scratch. It wasn't just fitted into what was the available architecture that preceded the creation. This was something built as a synagogue from scratch, and in that way was most unusual. The fourth of these great structures, and the largest, and also in the so-called Old Ghetto, which is to say outside the original New Ghetto, you'll get that straight sooner than later, is the one called the Scuola Spagnola, built either in 1555, as most people have opined, or Cecil Roth said, no, 1584. I haven't read a lot of strong arguments one way or the other, and it doesn't really matter to me. What matters is that this was the synagogue that was specifically designed for use by refugees coming from Spain and Portugal, but not directly. After all, the expulsion from the one place is 1492, the other place is 1496-7. So it's either Jews who are coming by way of time spent in Amsterdam, by way of time spent in Ferrara, or Jews slipping out, former Marranos, who are now trying to reach a place and a point where they can be openly Jewish, which would be interesting when you think about it, because after all, Venice is also Catholic. And yet they were presumably not too worried about the authorities of the Inquisition operating, and maybe in part that's because they're confined in the ghetto. So it's not like they're spread throughout the city. No one's going to really know if I was baptized back in Portugal or back in Spain and now I'm openly practicing as a Jew, and that, of course, constitutes heresy. So this, too, is a work that if it was built either 1555 or 1584, was radically redone in 1635 by the most famous Venetian architect of the era, Baldassare Longhena. He's an exact contemporary of Bernini. He lived between 1598 and 1682, and most known for his design of the Church of Santa Maria della Salute, but scads of buildings throughout Venice. So again, this is a community that could go to the best in order to do this redo in 1635. And we see again, at one side of the interior is this rather spectacular Hechal, which is to say Aron. And as so often you can see, there is a gate before it. So the idea of building a fence around the Torah, as in so many different synagogues, is here taken very literally, and we've done it with respect to the place where the Torah scrolls are kept, and we also do it with respect to the place from which the Torah scrolls are read. I would point out, furthermore, that there are 3 large chandeliers and 12 small ones, as if to suggest the 3 major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Treasar, the 12 who have shorter works that are part of the Hebrew Bible. And the last of these synagogues to be built as we now have it in 1575 is the Scuola Italiana, and it's ironic in a way. This is obviously, in some sense, it's the oldest community, but not necessarily in Venice. The Italian or Romaniot Jews would have been in Italy, Rome, and elsewhere going back to before the time of Jesus. And yet in this community, theirs is the smallest and it's the last structure to be built up. So in this Venice that has an array of spectacular synagogue interiors, of which obviously I've just given you a tiny bit of a taste, we're talking about a community that flourished in other ways as well. Publishers. David Bomberg, who published over 200 works that are of Jewish content, is the most famous. Justiniana, there's a series of publishers. There was Simon Luzzatto, who was well known for his doctrine of cultural exchange. He was a pioneer in terms of interfaith and intercultural, interethnic kind of dialogue or multilogue, polylogue. And most famously, of course, there was Léon de Modiner. Although he was originated from France, this was his home. And he was best known for the book that he published in 1637, A History of Jewish Rituals, at the behest of a Christian associate who wanted to try to understand what these Jews are doing. And it became the guidebook for Christians interested in figuring out what Jews are doing to understand Jewish ritual. He also had a very important student by the name of Sarah Copio Sulam, who had a salon. She was a poet and a salon way before people were having salons. She had a salon. So she was renowned in and of herself. And Leon himself was probably better known in his era, or preferred to be known, as a musician, as a cantor and as a composer. He is said to have innovated in musical polyphony, in particular in the synagogue at Ferrara, and he was buddies with Salomone Rossi and so on and so forth, a very important figure. I don't think it is surprising that when Shakespeare, in the early part of the 17th century, was looking for a setting for his merchant, that he chose Venice to be the setting of that Merchant of Venice, because the Venetian Jewish community clearly had a Europe-wide reputation by that time. Or put more simply, in the course of the 17th and 17th centuries, an enormous amount of growth and internal glories. By about 1630, there are something like 5,000 Jews living in this still relatively circumscribed area. I remember shortly thereafter, yet a third ghetto element will be added. And it wouldn't be until 1797, 1,000 years after the founding of the city, when Napoleon would take over, that the gates would be removed from the ghettos and they would be open and Jews would be free to go wherever they wanted to. Well, while Venice and its Jewish community were reaching an apogee of creative success with its synagogues and its other contributions to culture, there's another town north of the Alps that was offering its own glories, and that's Prague. Not a formal ghetto, but an informal ghetto, which is to say, in the 13th century, the Jews around Prague were basically forced in about a 3-day period to confine themselves to the area near the old city, Stare Miesto, that is outlined there in red. And eventually, within that confined area, we find no less than 6 synagogues and a cemetery that is rather extraordinary. In fact, symptomatic again of the limits in space, over many, many centuries, as Jews continued to bury their dead in the area that was allowed to them, you run out of space. So you start digging deeper and deeper and then piling upon piling. And over the course of the centuries, what with gases and everything else going on, things end up topsy-turvy and turvy-topsy and really rather extraordinary and dynamic and romantic. So what was really something that had a lot of negative connotations in terms of, again, confinement and prohibitive conditions ends up having a kind of aesthetic beauty that, at least in the modern era, we can appreciate. And these stones, of course, are overrun with symbols. So you have someone who has a name like Cohen, or some Slavic equivalent of that, and you've got a pair of hands, the priestly hands doing a priestly blessing at the top of the stone. Or you've got a ewer and a pitcher for water, and you understand that's someone who comes from the Levite tribe, as it were, by name of name. And sometimes, you know, the vintner, or the name that is, you have grapes, or the name, you have wolf, so you have a wolf, you have all kinds of imagery. And by the way, you have 6-pointed stars. Because in fact, this area is the first area in which the 6-pointed star as the shield or star of David, not to be confused with the shield or star of Solomon, not to be confused with being a symbol used in alchemy, not to be confused with the 6-pointed star used 5,000 years earlier in pagan antiquity, because strictly speaking, the triangle up and the triangle down meant the meeting of opposites, heaven and earth, by way of a stylized phallus and a stylized female cubic triangle. Not that, but a specifically Jewish symbol that will stand comparatively to what the cross has become for Christianity. This is the part of Europe where that first starts to take place, where it first starts to appear. And one of the places where that stuff appears is on these extraordinary gravestones that we run into. The oldest synagogue in Prague, in the Jewish quarter, at least as far as we know, at least as far as what remains, is what's called the Altneu Shul, the Old New Synagogue, the Staronovo Synagoga. Whether Altneu is because in the 16th century, much later on, they decided they had to separate it from these newer shuls that were now being built, or whether it comes from the Hebrew phrase Al-Tanai, connected to the tradition that the stones that formed the foundation were, of course, and you all knew this, brought by angels from Jerusalem. They were stones from the destroyed temple. So Al-Tanai, they're just there temporarily until such time as the Mashiach comes, and then they'll be taken back, as all the Jews will be taken back, to Eretz Yisrael, and the temple, of course, will be rebuilt. I wasn't there, so I don't know the reason for it being called the Altneu Shul, but I'm here to tell you it's called the Altneu Shul, and I'm here to tell you that it was built around 1270, and I'm here to tell you that it's a very unique and odd and strange Gothic sort of form, and that this synagogue is the exception to anything that you might call a rule about ascending, aliyah, to go in, because you actually go down to go into the synagogue by way of this lower building that you see around it. And you get inside, and the first thing we notice is that the bima is in the center, as it should be, because we're in an Ashkenazi world again. The second thing you notice is we've got this kind of cage, which is another version of taking very literally the idea of building a fence around the Torah that we see here. And the third thing we might notice, if you look at the far wall, at the window in that wall, we've got a 6-pointed star, and that's just not happenstance, that is to repeat, because the window comes later, is associated with this, with David, and therefore the Messianic hopes, and Prague was fraught with Messianic hopes. In fact, if you look at the frayed flag just above the bema, it's not just a frayed flag. It was the flag that was adopted by Solomon Molcho, who was born somewhere around 1500, had Messianic pretensions, hooked himself up, or tried to, and finally was able to hook himself up with David of Ruveni, another more quasi-Messianic kind of figure, and ultimately managed to get an audience with the emperor, the Habsburg Emperor, Charles V, and apparently they talked for 2 or 3 hours. No one knows what they talked about. All we know is that Charles decided that Molcho, who came from Iberia, so technically he's a Marrano, which means technically having been baptized, he's a heretic by virtue of pretending to be a Jew. And he says to Charles, we should get a combined Jewish-Christian army to liberate once again the parts of the Holy Land that are under Ottoman control, which they had been since 1517. Think about this. And so this is about 1530 or so. Charles ends up giving up handing him over to the Inquisition, that decides that he is the heretic that requires the appropriate end game for a heretic, which is you get burned at the stake. You understand the manner of moving someone to that other side who is deemed heretical has to exclude the spilling of blood, which is why burning is necessary, because you don't spill blood that way, just in case you're wondering why the preferred method was burning at the stake. In any case, one of the more interesting features of this uniquely Gothic styled structure is looking at the ribs of the ceiling, which are ordinarily, right, they're crossed. So the problem with that is you end up with a cruciform. But what you can see here is in each of the bays, there's a 5th rib that has been added so as to prevent this from being a cruciform. It's unusual, it's unique. And as I said, it's by the 16th century, perhaps, that this is being called the Altneues Schule. And that's around the time, late in the century, that the Meizel Synagogue goes up between 1590, 1592, thereabouts, based on a land grant from the Habsburg Emperor Rudolf II. And it was the wealthy Mayor Mordechai Meizel, whose name attached to this because he funded the building of the synagogue. But in 1689, there was a ghetto fire that swept everything, including the synagogue, in its wake. So what we're actually looking at is a neo-Gothic kind of rebuilt, whatever you want to call it, done at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, 1893 to 1905, which is a whole different time period. We just jumped 700 years between the Altneues Schule and what we're seeing here. And the same thing can be said about the synagogue that is referred to popularly as the Spanish synagogue, built in 1868 by Wojtek Ignaz Ullmann, who was a Renaissance revival style architect. But this ends up, as you can see, look at those keyhole arches and look at those double little tops. And when you look on the inside, you really understand that his style is this kind of Islamo-Moorish something style, with this wonderful complex of endless array of abstract decor and the multiple teeth around the arch that comes around the arc and encircles everything that centers on the Aron down below, is very much a Moorish kind of style, which was very popular at that point in time. And when we talk about internal glories, the same can be said from yet another synagogue from about the same time period. It's called the Jubilee or the Jerusalem Synagogue. And it was built in 1906. And the idea was to celebrate the Jubilee of Franz Joseph, the emperor. Now do the math. He became emperor in 1848. So actually the Jubilee is not going to be for another 2 years. So it was probably begun in 1906 and not finished until 1908. And as you can see, it's just overrun with a riot of color and gold. And the exterior is almost even more neo-Moorish than the previous image, that we just saw, and it's on Jerusalem Street. So that's why it's called the Jerusalem Synagogue. It's called the Jubilee Synagogue because it was to celebrate the Jubilee. Now, nowadays, of course, we don't talk about Franz Joseph because that was the Habsburgs, and we, Prague citizens, are free of the Habsburgs. So it's absolutely and emphatically called the Jerusalem Synagogue. Enough of this Jubilee stuff. That time period, though, the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, reflects in a few other interesting features that make the Jewish quarter of Prague interestingly unique. And so we're looking, for example, here at the town hall, which while at first was built in 1596, was remodeled at the end of the 18th century in the Rococo style you see before you. And most intriguingly, you've got your typical town clock up above with four faces, the normal kind of clock. But what you can see just above the wall line at the bottom of the roof line is what is absolutely unique, which is a clock with not only Hebrew letters, but it goes counterclockwise in order to go right to left instead of left to right. So it's a symptom and a symbol of how, in a certain sense, arrived the Jewish community in Prague had become by the late 19th, early 20th century, in a manner analogous to how Vienna's Jewish community had arrived, how Berlin's Jewish community had arrived, how Budapest's Jewish community had arrived. The end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century in Central Europe seemed to be a place, regardless of anti-Semitic outbursts, which were not infrequent, as we talked about earlier today, were really communities that were flourishing on all cylinders in all kinds of cultural and other ways. But if we backtrack to the 16th and 17th century for a moment, which is when Venice, to repeat myself, was at its height of accomplishment, that's the time when Rabbi Judah Loew, the Maharal, whose gravestone you see here isolated with the picture of the lion, because that's his symbol, his name means lion, Löw, was out and about. It was he who was both a master of esoteric Kabbalah and all kinds of secret formulae, and because of that, was able to apply his esoteric formulae to practical Kabbalah. And that yielded, of course, the creation of that humanoid, with which you are all familiar from that word in Psalms meaning shapeless, formless, the golem. And everyone knows the story. He went out by the river with three assistants. There are variants as to which the three assistants were, the beadle of the synagogue, his son-in-law, whatever. And each of them stood at the four corners of what he shaped out of earth, out of Adamah, this humanoid. And then because of his knowledge of esoteric Kabbalah, he recited formally walking around it 7 times this way and 7 times that way. And then the creature rose from the earth. Now, what needed the final touch to make that happen, there are 4 versions of the final touch, as you all know. He wrote the ineffable name of God, which I can't share with you because the JCC will fall apart if I share it with you, on a piece of paper and put it in his mouth, or he wrote it on his forehead, or he wrote the word truth, emet, first letter, last letter, middle-ish letter of the Hebrew alphabet, because truth encompasses everything, put it in his mouth, wrote it across his forehead. Those are your 4 versions, and that caused the creature to rise. And you all know the story that follows thereafter. But first, let me show you the image of Judah Loew enacting this. And what I find particularly interesting about this, I have no idea who did it, but the individual who very cleverly checked up on his or her Hebrew, except wrote on the forehead, Gimel Lamed Mem, which would be Golem. That's not what he wrote on the forehead. It should either be Emet or some version of Yud He Vav He or something else that would be the ineffable name of God. But you get the idea, and the intention, of course, is to get the idea. And of course, the Golem becomes a kind of local messianic figure. He protects the Jewish community from people who are trying to harm it. But the problem is that ultimately, he can only be controlled by Judah Loew, who knows how to control them by way of his knowledge. And you know the story, he's out of town one day and the golem kind of gets out of control. And so Judah realizes that ultimately he's got to decommission him. And erase the name of God or erase truth or pull it out of his mouth. And the body is placed in the attic of the Altneu Shul, where it will be kept until such time as it might be needed again. And it ends up as a kind of story about, you know, for Jews, the way forward is not through physical strength and violence. It's through other means. And the golem is the symbol of that which is the wrong means. And he inspires all kinds of, well, non-Jewish followers, as it were. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, that story that emerges in Germany, that ultimately leads to that magnificent work of music in the early 20th century by Paul Dukas, which finds its way into Walt Disney's cartoon version of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, is of course just one example of that. And then in the 18th century, before we get to Dukas, but after we get to the German version of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, we have Mary Shelley, who comes up, this is our golem, who of course continues to attract the imagination within Prague itself, so that we find in the Jewish quarter images of the golem. Bohemian Moravian mothers would say to their kids, if you don't eat your broccoli, the golem will get you. So it's a kind of boogeyman. And as I started to say before I interrupted myself, Mary Shelley was inspired to come up with the idea of Frankenstein. I don't know if she envisioned him looking like Boris Karloff, but Frankenstein is modeled, as it were, on the golem, this creature that is made not from the earth, not through divine intervention with esoteric Kabbalistic formulae, but through modern science, but ultimately can't become human. Does it have a soul? Does Frankenstein have a soul? Does the golem have a soul? And ultimately is either destroyed or has to leave because it can't dwell among humans. All of this coming about because by the late 19th century, this was an extremely, extremely popular kind of story. And as this sort of culminated in the Jewish world with a version in 1909 by Yudel Rosenberg in Yiddish, and then 2 years later, there was a version by a non-Jew, Gustav Meyrink, in German of the story, and that's actually the basis for most of what, when we think about the golem, we think about. Because when we talk about Judah Loew in the late 16th, early 17th century, there's very little in terms of detail. We get it in the late 19th, early 20th century. And you have an artist like Fritz Ascher, who was born in Germany in 1893, very much part of the art movements in Berlin and elsewhere, who would ultimately go into hiding in Berlin for 2.5 years during the Holocaust in the Grunewald. But this is 1916, and this is one of his most famous images. It is the golem. And you see him staring out at us, and below him you see Rabbi Loew and his 2 assistants. And the popularity would extend into the newfangled medium of filmmaking. And German Expressionist filmmaking was renowned in the Between the Wars period, as many of you know. So Paul Wegener made not 1, not 2, 3 different versions of Der Golem and wie in der Welt kam. The golem and how he came into the world, and that's Wegener himself playing the golem just before he opens his eyes. And even The Simpsons caught onto it at a much later time. But you can see the model for The Simpsons is the Paul Wegener version of what the golem looked like, as opposed to that clunky thing that I showed you at the outset, which is a much more recent sort of addition to the visuals of the golem. Well, by the time of Ascher, Fritz Ascher and all that stuff, the area of Prague and around it is really as happening as you could hope to happen. I repeat, Prague is like Budapest and Vienna within the Habsburg domains. It's like Paris and London and Berlin beyond those domains. It is a hotbed of fin de siècle modernism spilling over into the 20th century. And it's into that world that filled with Art Nouveau and all kinds of other avant-garde artistic expressions, it's into that world that Franz Kafka is born. Kafka, who, growing up in Prague, in a Jewish community in which they were speaking German, we had this conversation earlier today, so he's a minority within a minority. He's part of a Jewish minority that speaks German, which is a minority within the larger Czech-speaking majority. And clearly, he grew up wondering and worrying about, the world. One of his more famous works is called The Castle. I would much prefer to show you this to you in a night vision, but I have to settle for an image that by day. The castle starts like this. It was late in the evening when Kay arrived. The village was deep in snow. The castle hill was hidden, veiled in mist and darkness. Nor was there even a glimmer of light to show that a castle was there. On the wooden bridge leading from the main road to the village, Kay stood for a long time gazing into the illusory emptiness above him. And he found quarters for the night. Very shortly he was awakened. A young man dressed like a townsman, with the face of an actor, his eyes narrow and his eyebrows strongly marked, was standing beside him along with the landlord. What village is this I wandered into? Is there a castle here? Kay asks. Most certainly, replied the young man. Must one have a permit to sleep here? One must have a permit, was the reply, and there was an ironical contempt for Kay in the young man's gesture. Well, then I'll have to go and get one, said Kay. And from whom, pray, asked the young man. From the count, said Kay. That's the only thing to be done. A permit from the count in the middle of the night? Is that impossible? Inquired Kay coolly. Then why don't you wake me? Enough of this fooling, said Kay in a markedly quiet voice. Let me tell you that I am the land surveyor whom the count is expecting. My assistants are coming on tomorrow in a carriage with the apparatus. Land surveyor? He heard the hesitating question behind his back. I'll ring and inquire. And over 400 pages later, we still have not, with Kay, figured out what it is that he's supposed to be doing in this town in the shadow of the castle with a count whom he's never met and whom he can't seem to contact. It is the consummate, is the ultimate statement of existentialist angst, of existentialist confusion, of what am I doing here? And it's published posthumously. Because Kafka is dead by 1924 at the age of 41 of tuberculosis, and this novel was not published for another couple of years. But of course, the most famous thing that Kafka wrote is called the Metamorphosis. And let me just read you the opening lines. As Gregor Samsa woke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. What has happened to me, he thought. It was no dream. His room, a regular human bedroom, only rather too small, lay quiet between the four familiar walls. Above the table on which a collection of cloth samples were unpacked and spread out, Samsa was a commercial traveler, hung the picture which he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and put into a pretty gilt frame. And you probably all know the story. He cannot communicate because he's speaking insect language. It's like someone with a stroke. It's all going on in his head, but they don't hear the language. He's cut off from his own family. And in the end, it will be his own father who embeds a piece of fruit in his carapace. And ultimately, he will die, killed by his own father, and life will go on. It's spring, and they notice that his young sister is coming of age. They should start looking for a husband for her. So, of course, one thinks of Kafka as Kafka, one thinks of Kafka as the Jew, one thinks of Kafka as the creator of existentialist novels and stories, the father of all of that. And the notion of disconnection from those around you, he can't speak the language. Gregor can't speak the language. Gregor's a traveling salesman. The Jews were traders, they were merchants, they were salesmen. He's killed by his own father. That kind of flips Freud from his account later on of the killing of Moses as he accounts it by his followers that he connects to the idea of Christianity and its attack on its father faith, Judaism. Regardless, there's something prophetic about Kafka's writing because it would not take too long between the time of his death, 1924, and the arrival in 1933 into the throne of power up there in Germany of a true golem, a soulless destroyer. And in the course of the Holocaust, about a fourth of Venice's Jews would be deported and or exterminated. Most of Prague's Jews would be deported and exterminated, including those who were tasked first to gather in and label all of the Judaica from Bohemia and Moravia, because Hitler had in mind to create this extraordinary museum, which is why the Jewish quarter was not destroyed, to take place among and within these synagogues and the cemetery of this destroyed people, to show how extraordinary it had been, to show how extraordinary his actions had been in rescuing the world from Jews. The interesting thing during the Holocaust is that this famous statue of Judah Loeb that stood before the town hall was hidden by the locals, lest the Nazis find it and burn it, melt it down, because it's the great rabbi. he was so important to Prague's consciousness, and not just the golem will get you, but more than that, that this was hidden away to come out again after the end of the Holocaust, to be restored to its place before the city hall. Many of Prague's Jews, of course, on the way to Auschwitz, first pit stopped for a year, 2 years, 3 years at Theresienstadt, Terezin, that extends Prague's unique role as a hotbed of Jewish culture. You have artists like Dietrich Fritte, who in his work Film and Reality reflects on what the reality of Terezin is. So you see, first of all, think of Gregor the insect, think of the image of Kafka as part human, part insect, and now think of this figure with the six-pointed star on her chest, who is part makeup artist and part makeup table. And the camera, which is part cameraman and part camera, these hybrid beasts photographing as she makes him up for it, this Alta Yid, this old Jew, in front of the curtain, and of course, what's going on behind the curtain? We see a skeleton. And of course, everyone remembers about Terezin that it was this showplace that the Nazis liked to bring their guests to demonstrate how Hitler loved his Jews and had built this special city for them. And there'll be moments with gardens and moments with cafes and moments with warm coats. And as soon as the Swiss Red Cross or whoever else the visitors are gone, that stuff is taken away. But it was a world in which an extraordinary volume and intensity of music and visual art and poetry was being created. Hans Krascha, for example, born in 1899 in Prague, who died in Auschwitz in 1944, was a rising star in the Prague music scene. In 1933, he had an opera, Betrothal in a Dream, that was where the orchestra was conducted by George Szell, who eventually made his way, as a few of you know, to become this brilliant conductor in Cleveland. And it won the Czechoslovak State Prize. In 1942, he gets sent to Terezin. And there a children's opera that he created before but worked on further, called Wunderbar, is performed again and again under extraordinary circumstances, because your star the next day is taken, sent to Auschwitz, so you've got to get another star. Hansel and Gretel meets the Bremen town musicians. You've got this young boy and this young girl, these animals who are trying to free this town, but the evil organ grinder called Wunderbar, and everybody knew that was a stand-in for Hitler, was preventing things. Alas, in the opera, they triumphed over him. The irony is that the Nazis did not understand the obvious metaphor of Wunderbar and Hitler, because they would use this opera to show, again, in their propaganda film, how well things were for Jews in Terezin. Or Victor Ullmann, born in 1898, dies in Auschwitz in 1944. 1919, he comes to Prague, and he ends up conducting in what is now called the Prague State Opera. 1942, he goes to Terezin, an explosive creativity over the next 2 years of his life. Both Venice and Prague, the Venetian ghetto and the Prague Jewish quarter, and things that they spawned just beyond their edges, have in the last 30 years ago or so participated, have been particularly in the last 30 years or so polished up like cut gems. They represent the legacy of two particularly interesting and accomplished communities of urban Jews who turned constraints into creative outbursts and hellish conditions into their own paradoxic paradise, spiritual, cultural, intellectual paradise, that is. Thank you all very much. I'm tired, but I'm happy to entertain questions if there are any. And now Leonard is coming through the door, so he can tell us if we can. Yes,
Really
speak up.
quickly, there was a question on Zoom.
Uh-huh.
The first image you showed,
Yes.
there were 3 crowns, and someone wanted to know the significance of the 3 crowns.
In the Gentile Bellini image,
I believe so.
it has to do with, it's interesting that he imported that into Ottoman Turkey, because it had to do with the triple-headed leadership of the senatorial group within Venice. And so he just imported that into Ottoman Turkey. Yeah.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think you should mention also Lorenzo di Ponti from Venice, a Jew from Venice who wrote the libret for Mozart and for Don Giovanni.
That's true, that's true.
And ended up.
That's later, that's why I
Yeah,
left
that's
him
later.
out, because that's.
And ended up in New York.
Yes, yes, and the point very well taken. The only reason I didn't, obviously I was pick and choosing, but as in general in the 18th century, Venice is starting to decline, a la Alan's comment earlier today about cities that decline. So that's why I left him out, because I was focusing on 16th, 17th century, but absolutely, absolutely, sure. Thank you.
You mentioned Cecil Roth, who is about, he wrote about Donna Mendez,
Yes,
right? And is that the first time in history that we know of?
no,
Not
but-
a-
Could you repeat the
Yes,
question?
yes, I will, I
That
will.
you could have an economic boycott and change policy by a boycott?
Right, so Doña Gracia Mendez came from a Sephardic family that made its way to Belgium and then to Ferrara and the east coast of Italy. And her nephew ended up, in fact, as the vizier to Suleiman the Magnificent and Selim III. And under their regime, in fact, creates a semi-autonomous Jewish enclave in and around Tiberias in the 1550s. So she began, and at one point, she organized a boycott because of anti-Jewish activity on the part of the Ferrarans, where she was living. Maybe that is the first time. Yeah, but they're not associated with Venice, per se. Was there another question back there?
The synagogues that you showed
Yeah.
were in extraordinarily fine condition. Are they living or who's maintaining?
So first of all, by the time of these images, a lot of them have undergone restoration. So they're, because particularly after the Holocaust, people were not going back to live in the ghetto. If they could, they couldn't, and they wouldn't, because that's not where they wanted to be. So they were falling apart. But in the last, as I was saying very concisely in my last couple of sentences, in the last 30 or 40 years or so, there has been a strong effort in both those communities to renovate and restore. So they look in such good condition because of the restoration process. I don't think any of them, if you had seen them, let's say in 1950, would have looked quite as good as they do in these images. The basic structural role, what?
Jewish community?
Primarily Jewish community, yeah.
The Italian government also considers them part of the national cultural
Yes.
patrimony, so they're also getting Italian.
And that was later. That's when they began to figure out, probably after 1992,
Yeah,
when they
well,
watched the Spanish.
by the time you get to those pictures.
Exactly. So after 1992, when the Spanish realized, Jewish American tourists, Jews travel a lot and they spend money. So all of a sudden, come on home, and Spain becomes a hotbed of, let's remember our beloved Jews before we spat them out. And the Italians don't have a history, anything like that, nor do the Venetians, but they also got a little bit more on that bandwagon to make the ghetto area part of mainstream touristic visitation. So yes, from 92 on, the Italian government became more involved in contributing to this. Yes. Yes, Alan. This better not be about Emma Lazarus or New York.
No,
We're
no,
in
no.
trouble.
It's a terribly trivial question, given such a wonderful ground you've traversed. I have to ask, why does it the three major prophets in Treas are and not the three Avot and the 12 tribes?
And the answer is it could be the other and not the this. It could be one or the other. As you know, interpretation is what we call in English interpretation, whether it's visual or textual. So I took it as the three and the Treas are, but you could. On three things the world doth stand, right? So then the 12 tribes, absolutely possible. But just for the sake of arguing with you, you're wrong.
Fair enough.
Yes.
Any activity present time in any of the synagogues that you showed?
In the Spanish synagogue, there is some activity, and in the Tedescan synagogue, which is also connected to what is the Jewish Museum. I didn't even go into that. So there's a whole museum with all kinds of objects. and you get from that to the Ashkenazi synagogue, but I do believe it may occasionally be used, but I think the Spanish one is the only one that has a kind of, because there is a resident community there in part. There's Chabad there, there
My
are
next
shops and stuff
question,
like
if
that. So-
if it's activity, what kind?
well, Chabad for sure.
Chabad for sure.
I know this guy who is half Jewish, and he wrote me with great jubilation. This is probably 7 or 8 years ago. He'd been to Venice, and this Chabad rabbi came up to him, this Chabadnik. I don't know if it was a rabbi. I said to him, "You're Jewish, right?" And he said, "Well, yes." And so he put on tefillin for the first time in his life, and he was so proud of sort of quasi learning how to daven. So Chabad is of course there, but there is a small Jewish community that is active there.
That's in Venice.
In
What about
Venice,
Prague?
yes. In Prague too. When I first visited Prague in 1976, the numbers that I got were there are about 50 people throughout Prague who are willing to identify themselves as Jewish. The last time I was there, which is well after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I'm forgetting now, it was in the
Thank
middle
you
of the
for
90s,
recognizing that.
suddenly there are like 300 or 400 Jews.
Yeah.
And it's not just that everybody moved to Prague, but it was also people now came out of the closet of not being Jews to being Jewish. So there is certainly a community there, yeah. But even in 76, I remember there was a soup kitchen. I wasn't particularly interested, so I didn't go to it. And when I wanted to go to the Alten Shul, actually on Shabbat, because it was Shabbat, they said, no, tourists. I said, no, I'm here to pray. So it was even then on a small scale active. The others were not. The others for the most part are museums, as Hitler intended. It's ironic. And I didn't show you all, there's the Pinchas, which is a small, originally family synagogue that they were renovating, and now it's become the place where they have images of children's drawings and paintings and poems from Theresienstadt, and so on. But the Altnoy Shul is actually an active, on a small scale, synagogue.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I want to thank you for an absolutely
Thank you, Steve.
outstanding lecture.